Eleanor Vance, a no-nonsense accountant, discovers she's a witch, turning her orderly life into magical mayhem. With a chaotic bookstore owner, Yukio's gossip network, and a sarcastic familiar at her side, she must master her powers before they spiral out of control. Once Upon a Cozy Night welcomes you to a world of mystery, magic, and just the right amount of drama. So snuggle up, get comfy, and let's dive into tonight's tale. And if you love a good story, don't forget to subscribe, because there's always another tale waiting to be told. My life was a spreadsheet. Neatly organized, meticulously planned, and utterly predictable. Every day followed a precise schedule, from my 6:15 a.m. alarm to my 7:22 a.m. train commute to my 9 a.m. start at Vance & Company. Accounting. I thrived on order. Chaos, spontaneity, anything that deviated from the established plan. Those were my personal kryptonite. So, naturally, when I decided I needed a change, I approached it with the same level of calculated precision. City life, with its constant noise and relentless pressure, was starting to feel suffocating. I needed peace, quiet, a place where I could recharge and reconnect with myself. After months of research and careful budgeting, I found it, Willow Creek. A quaint little town nestled in a picturesque valley, far removed from the urban sprawl. The real estate listing promised tranquility, a slower pace of life, and breathtaking natural beauty. It was perfect. Or at least it appeared to be on paper. I purchased a charming, albeit slightly dilapidated, cottage on the outskirts of town, packed my belongings into labeled boxes, and traded my tailored suits for sensible cardigans and my heels for sturdy boots. The drive to Willow Creek was exactly what I needed. Rolling hills, fields of wildflowers, and the distinct absence of traffic jams. I could almost feel my stress melting away. The cottage, however, was a different story. Charming was definitely a euphemism. The paint was peeling, the garden was overgrown, and the interior looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. But I wasn't deterred. I'd budgeted for renovations, and I was confident that I could transform this fixer-upper into my personal sanctuary. As I began unpacking, a sense of anticipation bubbled within me. This was it. My new beginning. My escape from the spreadsheet. Or so I thought. The first few days in Willow Creek were idyllic. I explored the town, met the friendly, if slightly eccentric locals, and discovered the charming bookstore run by a man named Jasper Thorne. He was unconventional, to say the least. With his perpetually messy hair, mismatched clothes, and a wry sense of humor, he was everything I wasn't. And yet, I found myself drawn to his easygoing nature and his surprisingly insightful recommendations. One afternoon, while browsing the dusty shelves, I stumbled upon a particularly intriguing book. It was old, bound in worn leather, and the title was barely legible. Something about herbs? I muttered to myself, pulling it from the shelf. Jasper, who had been observing me from behind the counter, raised an eyebrow. That old thing? It's been there for ages. No one's ever been interested in it. Well, I am, I said, intrigued by its mysterious aura. And that, as it turned out, was the moment my spreadsheet-organized life began to unravel. The old book was even more fascinating than I'd initially thought. It wasn't just about herbs. It was a collection of spells, potions, and, well, witchcraft. I scoffed. Witchcraft? Seriously? I must have been imagining things. But as I flipped through the pages, the strange symbols and cryptic instructions seemed to resonate somehow. It was a bizarre feeling, like a long-forgotten memory resurfacing. I decided to take the book home, telling myself it would make for an interesting read. Little did I know, it was about to turn my world upside down. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't resist the urge to examine the book further. I carefully translated some of the simpler-looking spells, dismissing them as folklore and superstition. But then, I stumbled upon a passage about familiars, magical companions bound to witches. Intrigued, I read on, discovering a ritual for summoning one. It was ridiculous, of course. A black cat, a full moon, chanting ancient words. It was straight out of a fantasy novel. But a tiny voice in the back of my head whispered, "What if?" I shook my head, dismissing the thought. I was a rational, logical accountant, not some witch. But the image of a sleek black cat kept popping into my mind. And before I knew it, I found myself in my backyard, under the light of the full moon, reciting the ridiculous incantation from the book. I felt silly, embarrassed, and slightly insane. But then, a rustling in the bushes caught my attention. And out stepped a black cat. A very large, very sleek, and very unimpressed black cat. "Took you long enough," he drawled. His voice a surprisingly deep baritone. I stared at him, my jaw hanging open. You can talk?" I stammered. "Obviously," he replied, rolling his eyes. "Now, are you going to give me a name, or are we just going to stand here gawking at each other?" And that's how I met Barnaby, my sarcastic and incredibly intelligent familiar. He was everything I wasn't. Cynical, laid back, and utterly unimpressed by my organized life. He also had a penchant for gossip, which, as I would soon discover, was incredibly useful in a small town like Willow Creek. The next morning, I woke up to find Barnaby curled up on my chest, his purr rumbling like a tiny engine. "So," he said, stretching languidly, "what's the plan for today, boss? Are we conquering the world or just sticking to small-town mayhem?" I groaned. My spreadsheet life was officially over. Barnaby's arrival was just the beginning of my descent into the world of witchcraft. He informed me, rather condescendingly, that I was descended from a long line of witches, a fact that had somehow been conveniently omitted from my family history. He also told me that I needed to learn to control my powers, which, apparently, were dormant but starting to awaken. And the best person to teach me? Agnes Blackwood, the town's resident wise woman, and a powerful witch in her own right. The thought of meeting Agnes terrified me. I imagined a stereotypical witch with a pointy hat, a cackling laugh, and a cauldron bubbling with mysterious ingredients. But when I finally worked up the courage to visit her, I was surprised to find a rather ordinary-looking woman tending to her herb garden. Agnes was eccentric, opinionated, and fiercely protective of Willow Creek's magical traditions, but she wasn't the caricature I'd imagined. She agreed to take me on as her student, albeit with a healthy dose of skepticism. "You're an accountant?" she asked, her eyebrow raised. "Witchcraft and spreadsheets don't exactly mix, you know." Agnes's lessons were challenging. I struggled to grasp the concepts of energy manipulation, spellcasting, and potion-making. My logical, analytical mind clashed with the intuitive, often chaotic nature of magic. And Barnaby, of course, was always there to offer his sarcastic commentary. "Having trouble, boss?" he'd purr, watching me struggle with a particularly tricky spell. "Maybe you should try organizing your magic like you organize your finances. Alphabetically, perhaps." But despite the challenges, I found myself drawn to the world of magic. It was exciting, unpredictable, and, well, kind of fun. I also discovered that Willow Creek was full of secrets. The town, which had seemed so ordinary at first glance, was actually a hub of magical activity. The locals, who I'd initially dismissed as quirky, were all connected to the magical community in some way. And Jasper, the charming bookstore owner? He was secretly a powerful warlock, though he tried to hide it behind his laid-back demeanor. Jasper Thorne was a puzzle. One moment he was the charming bookstore owner, recommending obscure novels and making witty remarks about the weather. The next, he was radiating a subtle aura of power, his eyes holding a depth that hinted at something more. He was chaos personified, a stark contrast to my carefully ordered life. And yet, I found myself drawn to him. His easygoing nature was infectious, his sense of humor disarming. And his knowledge of magic, though he rarely spoke of it directly, was undeniable. Our interactions were a mix of playful banter and subtle flirtation. He'd tease me about my uptightness, while I'd roll my eyes at his chaotic lifestyle. But beneath the surface, There was a connection, a spark that ignited whenever we were together. I tried to deny it, telling myself that I was simply intrigued by his unconventional nature. But deep down, I knew there was something more. One afternoon, while I was browsing the shelves of his bookstore, Jasper approached me, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "You know," he said, leaning closer, his voice a low murmur, "for someone who claims to be so organized, you're surprisingly drawn to chaos." I scoffed. "I am not drawn to chaos," I retorted, though my heart did a little flutter kick at his proximity. "I simply appreciate variety." He chuckled. "Variety? Or maybe you're just starting to realize that life isn't as fun when it's all spreadsheets and schedules." He paused, his gaze locking with mine. "Maybe you're starting to embrace your inner witch." I blushed, flustered by his words and the intensity of his gaze. "I am not embracing anything," I mumbled, turning away to examine a nearby bookshelf. "I'm simply learning." He followed me, his presence a warm, distracting weight. "Learning what, Eleanor?" "How to brew the perfect potion. How to charm a grumpy gnome. Or maybe," he whispered, his breath brushing my ear, "how to fall for a charmingly chaotic warlock." I gasped, my cheeks burning. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, though my heart knew the truth. I was falling for him. Our relationship developed slowly, a dance of playful banter and hesitant touches. He'd help me with my magic lessons, offering cryptic advice and teasing me about my struggles. I'd try to organize his chaotic bookstore, much to his amusement. And Barnaby, of course, would watch us with a sardonic smirk, offering his unsolicited commentary. "Just get on with it already," he'd mutter, rolling his eyes. "The tension is thicker than a love potion gone wrong." The phone rang, a shrill interruption to the quiet of my cottage. It was Yukio. My best friend, Yukio, was a whirlwind of energy and gossip. She'd been my confidant through thick and thin, from my disastrous high school crushes to my escape from the city. And now, she was my lifeline to the mundane world. A reminder that there was life beyond bubbling cauldrons and mischievous familiars. Yukio, bless her heart, had a network of informants that rivaled the CIA. She knew everything about everyone, from the latest celebrity scandals to the juiciest local gossip. And she was always eager to share. "Eleanor, darling," she'd exclaim during our weekly phone calls. "You wouldn't believe what I heard about Mayor Thompson's wife. Apparently, she's having an affair with the town's, wait for it, dog groomer." I'd groan, trying to feign disinterest, but secretly, I was always intrigued by her tales. Yukio's gossip wasn't just mindless chatter. It was a way for me to stay connected to the world I'd left behind, a world that suddenly seemed so distant. But Yukio's gossip network also proved useful in my new life. She helped me uncover the history of Willow Creek, revealing the secrets of my magical ancestry and the town's connection to my family. She even helped me track down a long-lost relative, a distant cousin who was also a witch. And, of course, she was always eager to hear about my adventures in the world of magic. "So," she'd ask, her voice dripping with excitement, "have you cast any spells lately? Turned anyone into a toad?" Or more importantly, she'd add with a suggestive giggle, "Have you and Jasper finally kissed?" Yukio's support was invaluable. She was my anchor, my connection to reality, and my biggest cheerleader. She reminded me that even though my life had taken a dramatic turn, I was still the same Eleanor, just with a few extra magical abilities and a sarcastic cat for a familiar. And as I navigated the chaotic world of Willow Creek, I knew that I could always count on her friendship, her gossip, and her unwavering support. My life as an accidental witch was a series of mishaps and near disasters. I accidentally turned my neighbor's prize-winning roses blue, conjured a swarm of butterflies in the middle of the town council meeting, and nearly set my kitchen on fire while attempting to brew a simple calming potion. Barnaby, of course, was always there to witness my blunders, offering his dry commentary and occasionally lending a paw, or a tail, to help clean up the mess. But despite the chaos, I was learning. I was learning to control my powers, to harness the energy that flowed through me. I was learning about the history of Willow Creek, the secrets of my magical heritage, and the importance of community. And I was learning to embrace the unexpected, to let go of my need for control and allow life to unfold as it was meant to. And most importantly, I was learning to trust Jasper. One day, a dark cloud descended upon Willow Creek. A mysterious illness swept through the town, affecting both humans and magical creatures. Agnes was stumped, unable to identify the source of the affliction. The townspeople were panicked, fearing the worst. And I knew that I had to do something. I had to use my newfound powers to help. With Jasper's guidance and Barnaby's help, I delved into my spellbook, searching for a cure, a way to protect the town. I spent hours researching, experimenting, and practicing, determined to find a solution. And finally, after days of tireless effort, I discovered a spell, an ancient ritual that could heal the sick and restore balance to the town. It was a complex spell, requiring a rare combination of ingredients and a powerful surge of magical energy. But I was determined to try. The ritual was exhausting, draining every ounce of magical energy I possessed. But as I chanted the ancient words, I felt a surge of power coursing through me, connecting me to the very heart of Willow Creek. The townspeople began to recover, their strength returning, their spirits lifted. The magical creatures, too, were healed, their energy restored. And as the dark cloud lifted, a sense of relief washed over the town. I had done it. I had used my magic to save Willow Creek. The town celebrated, hailing me as their hero. But I knew that I couldn't have done it without Jasper, Agnes, Barnaby, and Yukio. They were my support system, my guides, my found family. And as I looked at Jasper, his eyes filled with pride and affection, I knew that I had found something more than just a magical community in Willow Creek. I had found love. But my journey wasn't over. I still had a choice to make. I could continue living in Willow Creek, embracing my magical heritage and building a life with Jasper. Or I could return to my old life, to my spreadsheets and schedules, leaving the magic behind. It was a difficult decision. I loved the order and predictability of my old life. But I also loved the chaos, the excitement, and the sense of belonging that I'd found in Willow Creek. And I loved Jasper. I thought about it for days, weighing the pros and cons, listening to the whispers of my heart. And finally, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't go back. I had found my place in Willow Creek, my purpose, my love. And as I stood beside Jasper, hand in hand, under the light of the full moon, I knew that I had made the right choice. My life as an accidental witch was just beginning. Epilogue. Years later, I stood in the garden of our cozy cottage, watching Jasper chase our two children through the flower beds, Barnaby weaving between their legs with an air of long-suffering patience. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink, a perfect backdrop to our imperfect, beautiful life. I smiled, a genuine heartfelt smile that reached all the way to my toes. Contentment wasn't a spreadsheet anymore. It was the warmth of Jasper's hand in mine, the sound of our children's laughter, the quiet purr of Barnaby curled up by the fireplace. My life was still a little chaotic, a delightful mix of spells, potions, and the occasional, much-needed spreadsheet to keep our finances in order. I'd even managed to convince Agnes to let me help organize her extensive collection of herbs and magical ingredients, a task that brought me a surprising amount of joy. The town of Willow Creek had become my home, its eccentric inhabitants my family. I'd found my purpose, not in the sterile world of accounting, but in the vibrant, unpredictable world of magic. And Jasper. Jasper was my everything. He was the chaos to my order, the spark to my calm. He challenged me, supported me, and loved me, not in spite of my quirks, but because of them. He'd shown me that life wasn't meant to be meticulously planned. It was meant to be lived, embraced, and sometimes, even messed up a little. And as I looked at him, his eyes filled with love and laughter, I knew that I had made the right choice. My life as an accidental witch was everything I'd never known I wanted. And it was just beginning. Jasper's epilogue.
The scent of lavender and old books always calmed him. He leaned against the doorframe of the bookstore, watching Eleanor as she meticulously arranged a new display of spell components. She'd come so far, from the uptight accountant terrified of a misplaced decimal point to the confident witch who could conjure a perfect cup of tea with a flick of her wrist. It still amazed him, the transformation. He'd seen the spark in her from the beginning, a flicker of magic hidden beneath layers of spreadsheets and schedules. He'd known she was meant for Willow Creek, meant for him. He just had to nudge her a little. He'd been intrigued by her from the moment she'd walked into the bookstore, her tailored suit a stark contrast to the bohemian vibe of his shop. She was so organized, so precise. Everything he wasn't. And yet, he'd sensed a vulnerability beneath the surface, a longing for something more. He'd teased her, challenged her, trying to break down the walls she'd built around herself. He'd known she was a witch, had sensed the dormant power within her. But he hadn't pushed. He'd waited, letting her discover it at her own pace. Watching her struggle with her newfound powers had been both amusing and endearing. He'd offered cryptic advice, enjoying her frustrated sighs and the way her brow furrowed in concentration. He'd known she'd figure it out eventually. She was Eleanor after all. Brilliant, determined, and surprisingly adaptable. And as he'd watched her embrace her magic, he'd fallen for her, completely and irrevocably. Her chaos was his calm, her order his excitement. She was everything he'd never known he wanted. The ritual had terrified him. He'd known the risks, the immense power she was about to unleash. He'd stood by, helpless as she'd poured her heart and soul into the spell, praying that she'd be okay. And when she'd emerged, exhausted but triumphant, he'd known that he'd never let her go. She was his witch, his partner, his everything. Now, years later, watching her with their children, he felt a warmth spread through him. He'd found his place in Willow Creek, not just as the bookstore owner, but as Eleanor's husband, as a father. His life was still a little chaotic, a mix of spell casting, book recommendations, and the occasional spilled potion. But it was his chaos, their chaos. And he wouldn't trade it for anything.
Phew, that was a wild one. Thanks for hanging out. I had fun. Hope you did too. If your jaw is still on the floor, don't worry. I'll help you pick it up next time. If you enjoyed the chaos, go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe. Because trust me, there's always more where that came from.